And if there's no Quran from the 7th century, that means Muhammad had nothing to do with it. And we are destroying Muhammad and the Quran in one fell swoop. Ooh, I love it. Folks, we got to be the first one to introduce it and get it into the public sphere. Because I hope and I really wish, I would like to see Islam destroyed in my lifetime. And I say it on radio, I say this on TV, I say it to all my Muslim friends. Because I hope and I really wish, I would like to see Islam destroyed in my lifetime. And I say it on radio, I say this on TV, I say it to all my Muslim friends.
J. Smith exposes deceptions and treacheries of Christian missionaries.
Let me give you an example of a C6 that I saw in Australia. 3 couples had just finished seminary there in Melbourne. They then went to become missionaries to the local community there in the center of Melbourne, the local Muslim community. So in order to do that, they took on a C6 model themselves. So these are evangelical Christians, Australian Christians, who have Bible degree behind them, who went and joined the Muslim community. They took on Muslim name, they wore Muslim dress, they moved into the community, they became part of the mosque, started teaching within the mosque. Because of their ability to understand scripture, they quickly rose up through the ranks and became, in one case, just underneath an imam of the mosque. One of my colleagues kept in contact with them, but they stopped all relationship with the Christian church, stopped all relationship with their own indigenous church. And this one of my friends who then would keep contact, the only contact they would have was with her.
Christian missionaries are lying, pretending and deceiving to spread Christianity. This is how Christian missionaries convert non-Christians to Christianity. The one true God stands for truth and honesty, and does not approve lie, pretension, and deception. Christian missionaries are emissaries of Satan. Christian missionaries are simply following satanic ways of deception and treachery to draft more minions. Did J. Smith ever participated in such shameful treachery and deception?
Well, actually, I was introduced to the antecedent to the Insider movement when I was going through Fuller Seminary, studying under Dr. Dudley Woodbury back in the 1980s, early 1980s. My wife and I were there getting a master's in Islamic studies before we were sent out to the country of Senegal, West Africa. And so we saw what was going on. We saw the missionaries and certainly what the seminary was doing at that time. We were told at that time that it was, of course, the name Insider didn't exist. It was more contextualization. I studied under Dr. Kraft and Dr. Hebert. So I studied under those who were, you might say, the fathers of the whole contextual movement. Both my wife and I went to Senegal assuming that we would use contextualization. It was the key word at that time. It was the key paradigm. We went to Senegal, West Africa. We found that the Muslims there wore grand boubous, so I bought many grand boubous. They're very expensive. There are these beautiful flowing robes with a beautiful filigree in the front, and they cost an awful lot of money. We were told we should go to the mosque, so we went to the mosque. We prayed with the Muslims in the mosque. We thought that this was being contextual. I grew a very long beard. I had a beard down to here. If you see pictures of back then, I looked fierce. And it was very contextual. I took on an Islamic name, a local name. So did my wife. So for all practical purposes, we thought we were culturally adapting, culturally contextualizing to Islam. And it didn't take very long before the Muslims started clapping me on the back and saying, "It's so good to see you've converted."
Beware of such Satans, in disguise of human being. The religion of the one true God does not require falsehood, deception, pretension, treachery, and satanic ways to guide mankind to righteousness.
O you who believe, stand out firmly for justice as witnesses to the God, even though it be against yourselves, or your parents, or your kin, be he rich or poor, the God is a better protector to both. So follow not the lusts, lest you may avoid justice, and if you distort your witness or refuse to give it, verily, the God is ever well acquainted with what you do.
When was New Testament written? And who wrote them?
All the three Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, were written before 60 AD. We know that John would have been written much later, about 80 or 90 AD. We know that Acts and also the letters of Paul were written within 15 to 30 years of Christ's death. So all the three Gospels, Acts, Revelation, all the Paul's letters were all written before the disciples left Jerusalem in 70 AD. This book, we make no problems. We know it was written by men. We make that claim from the very beginning. We know who wrote them. The man's names are usually given to the books. John was written by John, Matthew by Matthew, Mark by Mark, but we know that Moses wrote the first 5 books. What we do say is, that which is written, we can trust.
Let's hear the truth from Professor Bart Ehrman. Bart Ehrman is the James A. Gray Distinguished Professor at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Professor Ehrman completed his Master's of Divinity and Ph.D. degrees at Princeton Seminary. He is an expert on the New Testament and the history of early Christianity. 5 of his books have been on the New York Times bestseller list. His books have been translated into 27 languages.
When were the Gospels written? Well, they are not contemporary to the events they narrate. Scholars debate when the Gospels were written, but by far the most common datings are that Mark was written sometime around 65 or 70 AD, Luke and Matthew about 10 or 15 years later, John maybe 10 or 15 years later, so John maybe around the year 90 or 95, Matthew and Luke around 80 to 85. These are the dates that are taught throughout the universities and divinity schools and seminaries of North America and Europe. I take them to be right for reasons that I can give you if anybody really wants to know. It's complicated arguments. If these dates are correct, it means that our earliest account of Jesus' resurrection is 40 years after the event. 40 years after the event. Well, Paul was writing before that, wasn't it? Yes, Paul was writing before that. Paul talks about the resurrection in 1 Corinthians. Well, that's 20 years after the event, so that's better. The Gospels give us the narratives. Paul makes reference to it, but there's a 20-year gap. You don't have somebody who was there writing about it. Second point, none of the authors were eyewitnesses. Paul himself indicates that he was not an eyewitness, and none of the gospel writers was an eyewitness. People, of course, call the gospel books Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Well, they call them Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John because we don't know who wrote these books, and there's no point calling them Sam, Fred, Jerry, and Harry. I mean, they're written by people. We don't know who they were written by. They are anonymous. You might not think so because they have the title, The Gospel According to Matthew. Whoever put that title on it was an editor later. The original books are all anonymous, written in the third person. Moreover, the followers of Jesus were Aramaic-speaking peasants from Galilee, lower-class men who were not educated. In fact, Peter and John in Acts chapter 4, verse 13 are literally said to be illiterate. They couldn't read and write. Of course not. They were fishermen. They didn't go to school. The vast majority of people in the ancient world never learned to read, let alone write. And their native language was Aramaic. These books are written in Greek by highly educated, rhetorically trained writers who are skilled in Greek composition. Probably not disciples and don't claim to be disciples. Where did these authors get their stories from? Well, if they were not disciples of Jesus, they must have heard the stories from somebody, who heard the stories from somebody, who heard the stories from somebody, who heard them from somebody. Stories about Jesus, including his resurrection, had been in circulation year after year after year from the time that his disciples knew that he got killed and believed he got raised from the dead. They told stories to convert people. They improved the stories sometimes. They changed the stories sometimes. The stories got modified in the process of transmission over the course of decades before anybody wrote the stories down.
Conclusion. Original New Testament books were written half a century after Jesus by people who were not eyewitnesses. No one knows where it was written or who wrote them. A question for every Christian who are honest, knowledgeable, and not close-minded or obstinate. Is New Testament trustworthy? An honest person will never respond to this question yes. The honest answer to this question is no.
We know from the scriptures, from the Bible that is, that God has created us, both man and woman, in His image.
Yeah, let's talk about this idea of man and woman being made in God's image. Yeah, let's talk about this idea of man and woman being made in God's image.
Augustine, Bishop of Hippo and Latin Father, from 354 to 430, who said, I don't see what sort of help a woman was created to provide man with, if one excludes procreation. If a woman is not given to man for help in bearing children, for what help could she be? To till the earth together? If help were needed for that, man would be a better help for man. The same goes for comfort in solitude. How much more pleasure is it for life and conversation when two friends live together than when a man and a woman cohabitate? He continues, the woman together with her own husband is the image of God, so that the whole substance may be one image. But when she is referred separately to her quality of helpmeet, which regards the woman herself alone, then she is not the image of God. But as regards to the man alone, he is the image of God as fully and completely as when the woman too is joined with him in one.
Oh, can I just use hyperbole once again?
I want you to understand that Christ is the head of every man, and the husband is the head of his wife. And then he goes on and says, any woman who prays or prophesies with her head unveiled disgraces her husband. It's the one and the same thing as having her head shaved. And then it goes on, a man ought not to have his head veiled, because he is the image and reflection of God. But the woman is a reflection of man. A woman is not made in the image of God, according to Paul. Indeed, man was not made for the woman, but woman was made for the man. Okay?
But then the second question, which was really important, was, can God become a man? And as I said, if Muslims even ask this question, they need to be shamed by that.
Why is that?
Shame on them, because they're assuming that God can't do something you and I can't be. God can't even do what we are, which absolutely eradicates His omnipotence, to say nothing of His greatness, which is in their statement of faith. Allahu Akbar, God is the greatest. If He is the greatest, then He can easily become a man. That's simple. Otherwise, you've taken away His greatness and you've contradicted yourself. And I would say to Muslims, shame on you for even asking that question. Question they should have asked, and this is really the question that really is the important one. You should never ask me whether or not God can become a man. Please, Muslims, and I say this to you who are watching, don't ever ask that question again, because you're just exposing yourself to ridicule. And this is ridicule. Don't ever question God. And stop Muslims telling God what He can and cannot do. Muslims come up to me and say, you mean God went to the toilet? And I sit there and I look and I say, what? Of course He can go to the toilet. Can't your God go to the toilet? If He can't go to the toilet, your God's too small. Get a bigger God. Come on home. We've got Him. Ooh, do. If Muslims even ask this question, they need to be shamed by that.
Why is that?
Shame on them, because they're assuming that God can't do something you and I can't be.
God thought of people similar to the Palestinians, without homes, without shelter, for the heat and for the cold. God wanted to fully understand humanity And therefore, God in His love decided to come down on our level in the deepest love and understanding.
They're assuming that God can't do something you and I can't be.
God who loves you and me, and much like ants trying to go from this point to the other and cannot, you come by and you say, wait a minute, let me show them the right way. For there's a way that seems right unto man, but the way ends in destruction. So you say, I will help them. You try to show them the way, you push the nose of this one and the tail of the other, but they keep going back to their old way. So you say, I think the only way is either I become an ant or they become human. Now bear in mind that they cannot become human because they don't have the power. And suppose you have the power to become an ant. Now tell me, when you become an ant, can you show them the better way? Can you show them as-sirat al-mustaqim, the right way? And I answer you by saying, not on your life. Because once you become a man, as a man you become an ant, and once you become an ant, you end up being just like the ants.
If God wills, can He cease to exist? I'm asking you. If God will, could He cease to exist? No. There are certain things He could not. So use your brain now.
God is the greatest. If He is the greatest, then He can easily become a man. That's simple. Otherwise, you've taken away His greatness and you've contradicted yourself. And I would say to Muslims, shame on you for even asking that question.
God wanted to fully understand humanity.
Once you become a man, as a man you become an ant, and once you become an ant, you end up being just like the ants.
And stop Muslims telling God what He can and cannot do. Muslims come up to me and say, you mean God went to the toilet? And I sit there and I look and I say, what? Of course He can go to the toilet. Can't your God go to the toilet? If He can't go to the toilet, your God's too small. Get a bigger God. Come on home. We've got Him.
So what you're saying is that we can comprehend, but we can't fully fathom.
And who are we to even suggest that we can fathom that?
That's true.
God should be so great, so much above us,
Wow.
that to define Him by a mathematical formula, or to define Him so that we can understand Him, basically you're saying that He must be down on my level. And there is no, a true God. The true God is way above my thinking.
That's true.
This is a mystery that we're going to have to accept. Of course He can go to the toilet. Can't your God go to the toilet? There is no, a true God. The true God is way above my thinking.
That's true.
This is a mystery that we're going to have to accept. Ooh, do, 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 do. Ooh, do, 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 do.
Your friendly neighborhood Spider-Man at your service.
قل إن تخفوا ما في صدوركم أو تبدوه يعلمه الله ويعلم ما في السماوات وما في الأرض والله على كل شيء قدير.
There is only one God, La ilaha illallah.
I went ahead and did a second master's in Islamic studies at Fuller Seminary in California.
Obviously, we now know that the sonship of Jesus is not biological. It's inherited. It's relational. It's a relational title, as you are related to Australia or I'm related to America, nothing more, nothing less. But here's the real kicker. Why are Muslims even asking the question?
That's true, yeah. Why are they asking?
Well, because they shouldn't be, because the Quran is very clear that God can have a son. Did you know that?
No.
In Surah 39, Ayah 4. In Surah 39, it says it very clearly.
How's that? It's a contradiction.
It seems like a contradiction, and this really is a kicker, because what this is implying a biological son.
Are Muslims aware of this?
They're not even aware of this verse. The vast majority of Muslims, whenever I bring this to them, the first thing asking me this question, because your Quran is very clear that Allah can have a son. And it says, I'll read it. Had Allah willed to take a son, He could have chosen whom He willed out of those whom He created, but glorified is He. He is Allah, the one, the irresistible. So the Quran already admits that Allah can have a son anytime He wants.
Wow, it's like a hypothetical. If He wanted to, He could.
He could.
He could if He wanted to.
The possibility exists in the Quran, so why are they even asking the question?
Why limit Him?
And what's even more interesting, He could have His son from those He created. Now, what does that mean? Already it's showing either that He could create in that, give Him divine qualities, or that this is a relational title.
That's interesting.
Muslims need to ask that question. So really the question should go back on them. How can now Allah have a son? Tell me. And the next time you see a Muslim, and the next time they ask that question, go right back to them and say, now you tell me, how do you explain Surah 39, Ayah 4? Because I don't know. I don't understand this. Not even my scriptures tell me this, that God can create a son.
That's amazing.
God can create a son.
That is a really strong point.
How can God create a son? I'd like to know. And I'd like to know Muslims, how are they going to answer that verse? I have never in 29 years heard a Muslim that can answer that verse.
Now, can God make a square circle if He wants to? If God wants to, yes, certainly He could. He could also make a man. He could also make a human. He could also come down in the form of a man. That's perfectly legitimate, isn't it? If God will to. So God can do. Are you saying? Even your Quran admits that. Excuse me. 39:4. What does it say? What does it say? If God so had willed it, He could have made a son. If God so will, He could have had a son. So the possibility exists. Excuse me. The possibility exists, does it not? Shall I correct you, Mr. Smith? Shall we read it again? With a bogus PhD? Don't have a PhD. He said I did. Master. Okay. With a bogus master. What is the word used, have a son? What's the Arabic word used? I don't know the word off the top of my head. So why is that important? Because the Arabic word will tell you what this means. Ittakhadha. If God had willed it, excuse me, that He would have ittakhadha a son. He could have had his son. Now, what does ittakhadha yattakhidhu mean? The possibility does exist. No, what does it mean? What does it mean? I don't know. It's like, I take him as my son. This is ittakhadha, adoption, taking someone. It doesn't mean I literally beget. That is why you people need to learn how
Can you understand? Can you understand? That's exactly what the Bible says too.
Excuse me. Don't jump.
Any
Don't
Christian
jump.
believe
First
that
of
the
all,
Son of God was biologically from the God
excuse
seed?
me. You stop there.
Are there anybody
We
in
were
this crowd that
discussing
believes?
an issue.
No.
Can
This
God
is the issue what we're
make
talking
a
about.
square circle? You said yes, and he said even in your Quran, God says if God wills,
He could have had a son.
So
Is there a biological
excuse me,
son? No.
Excuse me.
Is it
I
an inheritance?
corrected you.
Yes.
I
And
corrected
that is
you
exactly what we're
in
saying.
your understanding that you are mistaken in what it means.
Mansur,
Secondly,
as Christians,
God
do we believe that God
does
biologically
not
had a
do
son? Do
God,
What
let's
kind of
come
son did he
back
have?
to the topic we're discussing. Don't jump.
So if God had willed to, he could have done that, could he not? The possibility
Excuse me.
exists.
If God wills, can he cease to exist? I'm asking you.
If God will, could he cease to exist? No. There are certain
Why
things
not?
he could not.
So you use your brain now.
And I'd like to know Muslims, how are they going to answer that verse? I have never in 29 years heard a Muslim that can answer that verse. In Surah 39, Ayah 4, this is implying a biological son.
I don't know the word off the top of my head. So why is that important?
What does it mean? What does it mean?
I don't
It's
know.
like, it doesn't mean...
In Surah 39, Ayah 4, this is implying a biological son.
لو أراد الله أن يتخذ ولدا لاصطفى مما يخلق ما يشاء سبحانه هو الله الواحد القهار.
This is implying a biological son.
I don't know the word off the top of my head.
What does it mean? What does it mean?
I don't
It's
know.
like,
And I'd like to know Muslims, how are they going to answer that verse? I have never in 29 years heard a Muslim that can answer that verse.
Foremost expert on Islam and Christian apologetics. His name is Jay Smith. You're a hero of mine. You're a hero of many. You're a hero of many. You're a hero of mine. You're a hero of many.
Hasta la vista, baby.
في قلوبهم مرض فزادهم الله مرضا ولهم عذاب أليم بما كانوا يكذبون.
And if there's no Quran from the 7th century, that means Muhammad had nothing to do with it. And we are destroying Muhammad and the Quran in one fell swoop. Ooh, I love it. Folks, we got to be the first one to introduce it and get it into the public sphere. Because I hope and I really wish, I would like to see Islam destroyed in my lifetime. And I say it on radio, I say this on TV, I say it to all my Muslim friends.
Let's hear the truth from Professor Bart Ehrman. Bart Ehrman is the James A. Gray Distinguished Professor at the University of North Carolina, at Chapel Hill. Professor Ehrman completed his Master's of Divinity and Ph.D. degrees at Princeton Seminary. He is an expert on the New Testament and the history of early Christianity. 5 of his books have been on the New York Times bestseller list. His books have been translated into 27 languages.
Throughout your work, like for 40 years, we noticed that your main problem about trust in the Bible and the authenticity of the Bible is the technique of transmission, which is we don't have the originals, we don't know who wrote the Bible or who are the scribes who copied the manuscripts. There is a parallel transmission technique in transmitting the holy verses or the holy scriptures, which is followed by the Muslims, by transmitting the Quran and the traditions of their prophet. Have you ever considered looking at their techniques in transmission, because they do claim that it is uneritable?
Right. So the first thing I'll say is that's one of the reasons that I've had trouble with traditional Christianity, is because of the changes that scribes have made in the text. But it's not the only thing. Another issue is the internal discrepancies that you find within the New Testament and within the Bible, and I do know that the Quran has been faithfully transmitted over the centuries, and for some reason Christians decided not to transmit their book as faithfully. But what I would say is that they certainly could have if they wanted to. Jews, of course, through the Middle Ages transcribed the Hebrew Bible faithfully, and for some reason Christians just didn't do that. There's not really not a lot to be done with the Quran, because I mean so many of these manuscripts are just the same. So there's not a lot of scholarship to do, because I mean with the New Testament though you have all these thousands of manuscripts that are all different from each other. So that makes the scholarship more interesting.
We never make this claim about the Bible. Can you prove? We would never make the claim about the Bible. We don't have the original Bible. We know it's been changed. We would never make these claims. Allahu Akbar! Allahu Akbar! Allahu Akbar! Please! Allahu Akbar! Allahu Akbar! We never make this claim about the Bible. Can you prove? We would never make the claim about the Bible. We don't have the original Bible. We know it's been changed. We would never make these claims.